So, a common question I always get is people always say, Nick, why didn't you start a zoo? Why didn't you open a pet store? Why didn't you do some sort of or start a nature center? Why didn't you start a brick and mortar sort of setup with animals? And, that's the sort of thing that sounds great on paper, but unfortunately, especially now in this economic landscape, it's really not feasible long term that- for taking care of animals. I've mentioned this in some other videos, but doing wildlife programs or doing anything with animals full time on a professional basis is really not that productive. So it's very hard to turn a profit, and it, we exacerbate that problem when we start a brick and mortar. And doing this for 20 years, big part, people don't realize how invested I am in doing wildlife shows. When I first started my company, I actually made it a point to travel all over the country and looking at different facilities to see what I wanted my business to look like. So I actually traveled to Texas to see somebody who does wildlife shows. I traveled to Michigan to see somebody who does wildlife shows. I saw a facility in Pennsylvania who did wildlife shows, and they had a brick and mortar also where people could come in, nature center. I've been to pet stores all over the country, and it can work. Been to zoos all over the country, and it can work, but everything has to fall into place just right. Systems have to be perfect, and it takes a lot of money to set it up properly, especially in this day and age. There's a very high standard and expectation that the public has for how animals are going to be displayed on exhibit. So, and like I was saying, in inflation and cost of everything, look at a restaurant. If you're a restaurant, you have to be absolutely perfect if you're going to stay in business. The food has to be perfect, the cost of everything has to be perfect, your service has to be perfect. I always tell everybody who's going into any type of a business, avoid a brick and mortar for as long as possible. You need to build your business, you need to build revenue, pump all that revenue back into your business. And then when you get to a certain point, years and years later, then maybe consider the brick and mortar. For example, if you're a chef, don't go into a restaurant immediately. Start a catering business out of your kitchen, and do it there that way and grow it organically. And that's kind of the model that I've also tried to adopt. Maybe 20 years ago, if you asked me if I would one day have a zoo 20 years later, I'd say, yeah, hopefully I have a zoo. I have a nature center. But we're also in Long Island, where the cost of rent and land and buildings is just exorbitantly high. So as where I am right now, I just don't see that as being economically viable. But I'm still happy doing mobile wildlife shows. So, I don't lose sleep over it or pine away for it. So hope that explains it just a little bit.